Hi, my name is Chris Bowe. I'm a regional analyst here at Intelligence Fusion, and today we're going to be talking about the EU, ASEAN, and how the two blocs respond to crises. So ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it consists of 10 member states, which are Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. And it is primarily a sort of economic union, with the first and foremost sort of stated aim of the bloc being to enhance economic growth and development in the region. And actually, of these member states, you have countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, which are consistently ranked amongst the fastest growing economies in the world, as well as countries like Singapore, which are well-established global financial hubs. So you can see how the economic side of this works. But they also have other stated aims which have developed over time, and these include the promotion of regional peace and stability, socio-cultural growth, as well as focusing on ideas such as the rule of law and democracy. The institution has some international sort of bases and embassies in global cities across the world, and another key and quite distinct feature of the bloc, which makes it unique in a way, is that it has a dedicated policy of non-interference in the affairs of member states, but this is a policy that's increasingly coming under strain with events such as the coup in Myanmar. So looking at the internal issues within ASEAN compared to the internal issues within Europe, I think a very distinct thing would be the fact that the member states of the EU broadly agree on sort of ideas such as democracy, free market economies and capitalist system. In fact, to join the EU, you have to meet something called the Copenhagen criteria, which establishes these ideas as well as the rule of law as a sort of barrier to entry. And while some countries such as Poland and Hungary have in recent years sort of been criticised for appearing a bit more right-wing than the general members of the bloc, there is, on the whole, an ideological and political sort of unanimity. They all broadly agree on the same things. In ASEAN, however, there are quite significant political and ideological differences within the member states. So countries like Laos and Vietnam, for example, are communist and one-party states, which stands in stark contrast to the more economically free and liberal countries such as Singapore, which are very capitalist in nature. Equally, you have countries in ASEAN which aren't actually strictly democracies, such as Laos, Vietnam, and most recently with coup Myanmar, which actually stands in stark contrast to ASEAN's stated goals of promoting democracy. So these are quite significant internal issues that will limit cohesion if there is such broad ideological differences between the member states. That's why the policy of non-interference has become so significant to the bloc, and also a significant problem which hinders sort of the chance for the bloc to grow or for greater unification between the countries. Other sort of political differences, which sort of may initially seem not to make so much of a difference, but actually do, are things such as religious differences. So in Europe, broadly, those who do profess to be religious are some form of Christianity. While in ASEAN, for example, you have states which are majority Muslim-led, others which are Buddhist, and then some which are Christian. And while sort of religion you could see as being separated to economics and politics, actually because religious persecution is still rife in some countries such as Myanmar, where the genocide against Rohingya Muslims occurred, this can cause significant tensions between the member states. And as such, it's another factor that hinders the chance for the bloc to grow and become more interconnected. So looking at things such as security issues, while a proud boast of the European Union is that since its formation, none of the member states have ever been at war with each other, and that things such as insurgencies are sort of almost non-existent, especially since the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and this has been a proud boast of the European Union. ASEAN, in comparison, does actually have quite significant security issues within the member states. While there's peace between various members, we do actually see armed conflicts and rebellions in countries such as Myanmar, where since the coup and before the coup even, there was significant insurgent and rebel action in sort of the borderlands, the rural areas, and now even more so with terror incidents occurring in the major cities, with these attacks usually targeting government or military officials. In Thailand and the Philippines, you have sort of Muslim-led insurgencies in the south of the country. So in Thailand, these occur in the 3 southern border provinces, while in the Philippines, this occurs in Mindanao, which is an island where there's an ongoing insurgency. Indonesia, too, suffers from armed conflict in West Papua, with West Papuan separatist movement fighting against the military, who in turn have been accused of violent reprisals and atrocities against the civilian population. So with these great levels of violent instability, you would think the bloc would take a unified approach to dealing with them, but due to the policy of non-interference, it's actually left to each individual member state to handle these uprisings and crises, and the bloc only really focuses on conflicts between nations. Other than just armed conflict, a major sort of security issue in a way is that ASEAN is home to the Golden Triangle, which is the border area between Myanmar, Laos and Thailand, and it's actually one of the global centres for the production of methamphetamine and opium. But again, there's not much sort of cooperation between the member states to crack down on this. So looking at various different crises and how the EU has responded compared to how ASEAN has responded, we're going to look at two examples, which is the coup in Myanmar and then most recently the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So with the coup in Myanmar, the European Union, all the member states as individual nations were broadly agreed and condemned the coup. And the bloc itself implemented sanctions and sort of bans on members of the Myanmar military. ASEAN, however, despite Myanmar being a member of the bloc, has had a very weak response and actually a very divided response. So you had countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore, which were quite sort of forward and strong in their demands for release of political prisoners, for example. But overall, because of the need for consensus within ASEAN, the actual bloc's response was quite weak, simply calling for sort of humanitarian aid, for discussion between groups and for an envoy to be sent. And despite these quite modest demands, Myanmar was actually able to sort of say that they shouldn't even be enacted because it violated the principle of non-interference and the idea that the bloc would be talking to what it termed terrorist groups. Meanwhile, with the war in Ukraine, as we've seen, the European Union has actually looked at its most unified as it has in years, with previously rebellious countries such as Poland and Hungary actually speaking with one voice with the rest of the bloc in demanding sanctions. While there has admittedly been some disagreements over the extent of it, especially with financial sanctions or oil and gas cuts, where members such as Germany initially have been quite hesitant, we have seen on the whole quite a unified effort and quite a strong effort to respond to Putin and the Russian invasion. And most of these sanctions have, of course, taken the form of financial or broadcasting bans, but we've also seen things such as the direct provision of arms to Ukraine, which is a historic move for the European Union, an example of how actually the bloc, despite sort of prior concerns, can respond very strongly to crises. ASEAN, again, however, with the Russian invasion, has responded quite weakly. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So the first is that member states are divided in their views on Russia. So you have countries such as Myanmar and Vietnam that are pro-Russia and rely heavily on Russia. So with that, you had Myanmar on its own state that actually supported the invasion, while you have, on the other hand, countries like Singapore, which have enacted travel bans, sanctions, and bans on tech exports. And this is because Singapore puts a high value on the idea of sovereignty. It being a small nation with not a particularly large military, it relies heavily on the pre-established sort of international order for its own safety and security. And the other reason for actually ASEAN having a sort of mixed response is due in part to its complicated relationship with China, which is, of course, currently seen as being on side with Russia or at the very most neutral. So yes, developing that point on China a bit further, and how sort of the blocs react and work with regional superpowers, much has been made in recent weeks about why the EU became so heavily involved with Russia, also dependent on Russian oil and gas, especially considering the ideological differences, the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, as well as the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But ASEAN too has a very complicated relationship with its own power, China. And in part this is due to the fact that China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, and actually since the pandemic, ASEAN has become China's largest trading partner. So there is a mutually beneficial relationship going on there in regards to just economics and trade. China also has invested heavily in the region, and the Belt and Road Initiative has spread throughout the member states. So due to this pipeline of money and infrastructure development, it's easy to understand why the ASEAN nations should have quite a good relationship with China. But the main sticking point is the South China Sea dispute, where you have countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam having large areas of contested maritime territory, while Malaysia and Brunei have also got some contested territory, but is much smaller. So with the development of military bases on sort of these disputed islands and Chinese aggression in the region, naturally the bloc is very concerned and wants to sort of maintain peace with China while also protecting its own interests. And actually Vietnam, out of all the member states of ASEAN, is probably the most resistant to China. While it's happy to cooperate on matters of sort of economics and infrastructure, it does remember the fact that it was invaded in 1979 by the Chinese military. It directly borders the country, and as such, it would be the one most at risk of any sort of deteriorating relationship between the bloc and China. I think also ASEAN member states look sort of quite with concern towards Taiwan, due to the fact that many of them are small countries with not particularly large militaries. They do rely heavily on the pre-established idea of national sovereignty. So if Taiwan were to be invaded and its sovereignty violated, this would naturally be a massive cause of concern for member states. And as such, I think they are watching how the situation in Ukraine develops and trying to figure out whether, in fact, China would still go ahead and try and sort of reunify with Taiwan, considering the sanctions that have been placed across Russia.
Thank you for watching that episode of The Insight. If you found it interesting and you'd like to stay up to date with our latest content, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel.